Hi everyone. We're going to look at the mediums in art over the next few lectures. We'll go over drawing, we'll go over painting, we'll look at printmaking, then we'll look at photography and film, and then we'll go over sculpture and then architecture. So that will be the next several lectures, looking specifically at art mediums. Let's begin by looking at drawing. Pull up the drawing lecture here. So typically, before maybe the 20th century, drawing was something that was done as a preliminary way for artists to figure out how they were going to produce paintings or sketches for how architects were going to plan forms in buildings. Maybe they might do sketches to figure out forms for making sculpture. Drawings weren't necessarily always done as final pieces, although many of those preliminary sketches and drawings are now very valuable. Say if Michelangelo did them for the Sistine Chapel, we'll see one of those today. Starting though in the 20th century, and I think today also, you do see a number of artists, many of them I'll show you today, who make drawings as their artwork. One example here is Lori Lipton. She has been drawing a long time on really large sheets of paper, and on these sheets of paper, she makes drawings of outmoded technologies. She uses images from social media, and some of her early work also included images from photographs from the 1800s and the Victorian era. Here, done in graphite, which is pencil, we are looking, and I'm assuming probably different pencils. So pencils and charcoals are labeled based on their hardness or their softness. The more soft they are, generally the blacker the mark is. The harder they are, generally the lighter the gray is. So probably she's using a 4B or a 6B, a soft graphite pencil to get her blacks. I would guess maybe a 2B or a 3B. 2Bs are kind of standard yellow pencils you might have used in school. And then to get the light grays, probably a 2 or a 3H, which are typically the harder leads that make softer grays. She has really beautifully rendered the grass from a very light atmospheric kind of gray out of the white paper into the foreground where there's lots of detail. Her drawings are made up by putting lines next to each other, hatch marks, and then crossing those marks with other hatch marks to make cross-hatching. And these are very labor-intensive drawings. I think this one's a pretty interesting one of her drawings. This looks like a Victorian age, maybe Western funeral here. And the woman in the casket, she still has her face on, and all the people sitting around her have no skin on their head and skulls. And the guy closest to us appears to have his head drooping back and his mouth open. Now, there is a single man hidden here with a face, but for the most part, it is dead mourners of a dead person who still has their flesh. Perhaps this is an imaginary funeral of the dead bringing in a newly dead person into their world. I'm not sure exactly. So this sketch probably is recognizable in the painting, that kind of really well-known painting that Michelangelo does in the Sistine Chapel of Adam reaching up and giving his finger, and this very sexy, muscular leg god in a short tunic is flying with a cape that looks like the cutaway of a brain and a brain stem. Under his one arm is Eve and some other things, and he is about to give Adam his brain. Here we can see a preliminary sketch done in red chalk, And in this preliminary sketch, we see what he does so well, his muscular torsos, where he has defined the chest muscles and the serratus muscles, and we see the back muscles, the latissimus muscles. And he also does something that in figure drawing that you do to make the figure more realistic. Not only getting proportion and anatomy right, but what is known as shadow massing. So when you shade the body like you're shading a cylinder, and you can see the round marks here of the leg, cylinder. The fingers are cylinders, the arm is a cylinder. So you're always kind of doing these marks that are implying that there's a rounding. But then you also, at the same time, you need to have a hard shadow in areas of the body, like a cube, as if you were shading a cube, with the front side being light and the side being darker. And you can see where he has preliminary, I think, shaded in all the muscles, and then it looks like he has shadow masked that entire area of the body, pushing it back in space. You see the same technique in the cylinder of the arm here, and then also the shadow massing here that pushes back that part of the arm. Same thing happening here, same thing happening here. Very common technique in good figure drawing. Of course, sketchbooks, I think many artists keep sketchbooks. I do as well. Sometimes my sketches are meant for paintings or for something else. And sometimes my sketchbooks, just the sketches are there just to live as drawings in a sketchbook. Da Vinci has some of the more famous sketchbooks in the world. A sketchbook on scientific drawings, sketches on anatomy dissections that he does. And he also is well known for writing in ink and writing all the words backwards. Here we're seeing some of his mechanical inventions. We see some mathematical equations. I suspect he's writing backwards because he's left-handed. And when you're left-handed and you write from left to right, especially in ink, it's likely that you're going to smudge what you wrote because your hand will get in the way. So if you're left-handed and you write from right to left, you're less likely to smudge any of your ink. I suspect that might be what he's doing rather than some secret code. Because if it's a secret code from someone we consider to be such a genius, it's a fairly easy code to crack, isn't it? We see early drawings on things like cave walls. Here we see I think it's a reproduction of a bison at Lascaux or Altamira in Spain, or Lascaux in France. It just looks in too good of a shape to be 10,000 years old or more. So it looks like probably black charcoal makes up a lot of the hair and the hooves. And I'm guessing some sort of red clay is probably making up the reddish part of the bull, drawn on a cave wall. We also see, we either call it painting or we could also think of it as drawing too, done on the ceramics that we might see in the classical Greek era in the red style pottery, where they are putting a slip on the images, are on the they are drawing in the negative space, and then the firing of the clay is creating that kind of reddish style that we see here. So then, rather than it being drawn in red, it's probably drawn in black. Early forms of writing also include writing on papyrus, which is a weed that was developed in ancient Egypt. It is made by putting plants together and crossing them and drying. This is where scrolls come from. We also have parchment, which would have been from the skin and stomach lining of sheep. And then in China, they were drawing on silk. And we also then have paper. And paper comes out of China and is invented by crushing wood pulp together and then using a screen to thin it out and to make paper. And that begins around 100 BC. So typically when we think about drawing materials, we usually don't make our own. We often buy them. You can buy cheaper forms in grocery stores and pharmacies. But generally, artist grade has more pigment and less binder, like artist grade colored pencils instead of kids colored pencils, or artist grade pastel instead of kids chalk. Usually the cheaper it is, it means it has more binder, less valuable pigment. Dry media is generally in stick form and then dragged over a surface that will leave the particles behind. We find stick form in graphite pencils that's surrounded by wood. We find it in various forms of charcoal, stick charcoal, willow charcoal as well, where we just have the stick and nothing binding it. We might find it in colored pencils, also in stick and dry form, and also in pastels, generally in a stick form with no wood or no binding that goes around it. We also have liquid media that might be applied with a pen or a brush. We generally think of drawing being black ink rather than painting, but I think once you start to use a brush, it does begin to confuse whether it's a drawing or a painting a little bit. The other thing that we generally need is paper. And then, of course, various erasers. Maybe a hard pink eraser for completely getting rid of marks, and a soft kneaded eraser for gently either moving around charcoal or just kind of maybe flattening the charcoal or getting some sort of light design that's erased from it. Drawing is an additive and subtractive process. The brush here is probably not used for painting, but used for wiping off any debris that you might get from when you erase something. So starting with some of the dry medias, graphite. So graphite is a crystalline form of carbon discovered in the 1500s. What this means is that probably Leonardo da Vinci never used a pencil. He used probably charcoal and chalk. He did metal point. But pencil, as we know and we all use it, generally we might find it surrounded by wood and bound by wood. You can also buy it in holders where you buy the leads and then the leads fit into the holder and they're reusable. This is a large graphite drawing by Carl Handel. Carl uses a projector and he projects the image on large sheets of paper, and then he uses 3 or 4 different charcoals or graphite to create blacks to light grays like I described a little bit earlier. Carl's work is always very smart. He has an undergraduate degree in semiotics from Brown and a master's degree from UCLA. I think in this particular drawing, I think what's interesting is not only the level of realism that Carl is able to achieve, but also I think it's here with the Jimmy Carter mask and the Richard Nixon mask and the Kennedy mask, is that we're looking at politicians and the idea that politicians are not really themselves. They wear a mask to make themselves likable and to get elected. And I think that the more that you look into that, I think we all wear masks at various locations in our life, and we play these roles, we perform these roles in society. I think it's a very good and smart drawing by Carl. So metal point comes before the graphite pencil. So they used relatively soft metals like maybe silver, and then they use a roughed up paper, and then they're able to make the hatch marks, which you see here. And he's able to get also a very soft kind of chiaroscuro here in the face that he's working on in this sketch. I have a video that shows you how metal point works. I will show you just a couple of seconds of this here. I put up these videos last night, so they might need to reset before they play perfectly.
In fact,
like that.
let's use these 2 coins. This is an old 1944 penny, which I think my father-in-law had in his pocket for luck. And there we go. And that gives a distinctly greenish tone, but it still works. See, it still leaves that grey track, but once again, once it tarnishes, you'll get a colour on it, which is not an attractive one particularly. Now the old Australian 50-cent piece is good because it's got very high quantities of silver. So if you use that, very, very dark, see? Goes on extremely dark.
And he is able, using this technique,
on these, but that's
to make
very,
very
typical of a
realistic
gold point
images. So
drawing.
that's called metal point. Charcoal goes way back into history. Probably the earliest drawings are in charcoal, which is burnt wood. So we might find charcoal in vine or willow twigs. We find that it's black and brittle. It's often very light and creates a soft scattered line that smudges really easily, much more easily than graphite does. I think this is an interesting charcoal drawing by Von Jaquette of 3 Mile Island. It looks like it's reversed the values, almost like it's an X-ray. I want to show you a charcoal drawing done by Zimone Tan, and it's a really, really great drawing here. So we're going to have to suffer through a couple seconds of the commercials, and here we go. Almost here we go. Like I said, probably I made a mistake by getting these things set up last night. So notice that this sped up video, he is working almost like a sculptor. He's not drawing in outlines or contour lines. He is establishing grayscale, and then notice that he uses his fingers to smudge the charcoal. He will also use a brush where he crushes up charcoal and makes lines with it. We will see him use a kneaded eraser where he will erase parts off. And he'll also use a cloth, which he also is using to smudge things around. So that little black piece that you see that's really thin, that's a willow twig there. He has a kneaded eraser, which is erasing lines for him. Charcoal is a medium where you really are trying to get dirty with your medium. And Tan is really good at what he does here. So he is going to put on and he is going to erase, and this body is slowly going to emerge. Again, really closer to sculpting than drawing with outlines and contour lines. And by the end of this drawing, he does not release the figure completely from the shadow under the legs or in the head, but he does, I think, at the end of the drawing, make a really satisfying drawing here. He's really good at this. Notice that he opens up the back to allow the light that's hitting the figure to blend value-wise with the background to the back. He's really good on the details with the toes, and he's really made drama between the dark and then the light of the rib cage and of the latissimus dorsi and the deltoid muscles. Very, very, very good at drawing, and an example of an artist working in charcoal. We also have colored dry materials, crayon and pastel and chalk. We are looking at pastel on the left by Edgar Degas. Pastel basically is the same kind of technique that we just saw in the charcoal. You use the sticks to rub them on, you wipe them around, and if you want lines, you use the sticks to make lines at the end. So you're going to kind of rub on to get the flat areas of color and shadow, and then any detail that you get at the end, you're drawing on top of those flattened areas. And maybe a similar technique in chalk too, where chalk can be used on paper. This is a graduate of Art Center, and what he does is he goes around the world doing these drawings in chalk on the streets, and he's very, very good at what he does. But a lot of us maybe have used colored pencil. This is Eric Yanker. He's a contemporary artist, and he is copying a genre painting from the Dutch from the 1600s, a party painting, and boy, are they frolicking it up. And then he's added in Michael Jackson, the king of pop in the 20th century, and I'm guessing that's getting the party to ramp up to another level. So colored pencil doesn't necessarily move and erase very well because of the wax in it, so you kind of have to be very careful and very deliberate about how you use it. Another pastel drawing by Degas. You can see the abstractions, and even you can see the texture of the paper here. And notice how soft you can get pastel. That softness, you can't really do the same with colored pencil. Generally, if you want to get that effect in a colored pencil drawing, you might airbrush over it to get that softness. The wet materials, pen and ink. So with pen and ink, you can buy that pretty easily, usually in plastic form, and then they have different thicknesses for their drawing end of it, and you can buy them from very thin to very thick. You can also get them calligraphic as well, and depending on the ink, you can put them on just about any surface. This is a page from the sketchbook by a comic book and concept artist from Korea, Kim Jung-gi. And Kim does some of my favorite drawings in pen and ink. He is super good at what he does. He's done thousands and thousands and thousands of drawings in his life. And I'm going to show you a live drawing that he does, and there's a number of those videos. The one I'm going to show you, I think, is the first live demo that he does. So here we see his mastery of perspective, of anatomy, of course, for concept artists, of telling stories. And we see the cat, the bottle of booze. We see the equipments for the tattoo and all the tattoos that have been done. Really solid, really, really great, great pen and ink drawing. So here's Kim here. And again, probably, oh, it didn't reset. Oh, it's going to reset. There we go. No commercials. Okay, so he's working with a marker here. And you can see that he is just so masterful because he's drawn people and cars and things so many times. He just is masterful at 3D forms, the crush can, the gun in there, the dashboard, the guy sitting at the car. It's really amazing. This is a sped up video that's over an hour long. And one of the favorite things that I think he does here is his mastery of an engine. And again, he has broken down forms into cylinders and cubes and pyramids, and he understands anatomy. And by the time this drawing really gets kicking, like, there's just so much stuff in it. So this is still the same sheet of paper that he's now added this into. There's people, there's scuba divers, there's elephants. His more recent live demos, and he died recently, his more recent live demos, I think he has a more cohesive picture where everything is lit dramatically, much more like the charcoal drawing that we just saw. But again, one of the great, great artists of our era. Of course, when we think about pen and ink and dipping a nib into ink, of course we think of Chinese calligraphy and letter making, some of the most masterful, not letter making, but hieroglyphic making. Not hieroglyph either is the right word. It is a pictorial language and a pictorial narrative rather than a phonetic narrative, and done when it's mastered with no hesitation. We also see a preliminary drawing here in pen and ink by Rembrandt. So usually landscape artists, before easels, collapsible easels, and paint is made in tubes in factories, and you can just buy the paint, you had to make your own paint. And generally, you didn't paint outside. You generally painted in a lit studio. So if you were going to do a landscape, you would do that in pencil or here in ink and get an impression of the forms, maybe a little bit of the light and dark and shadow and lighting, and then take it and give it color in oil paint. Contemporary artist Raymond Pettibon, he is a former illustrator for the punk band Black Flag. He did all of their posters and their flyers. I think he also did the really famous logo with 4 bars for Black Flag. He's represented by Regan Projects in Los Angeles, He generally has a show with lots of drawings, no frames, just kind of hung up on the wall or pinned to the wall. He does them fairly quickly, comic book style. And he is working with, I think, both pen and brushes, probably brushing in the flat areas here. And he has a punk attitude, and I love his art. Here where he got this guy with a gun and very strange eyes looking for a handout, it looks like. And the headline says, OD a hippie. Legalize heroin, ban hippies and New Yorkers. And the guy is saying, your money and your drugs, man. Great, great drawing. Very punk attitude. We also see other artists who are using collage, and we're putting collage in our drawing lecture here in Getlin's book, Living with Art. Mark Getlin is the author of Living with Art, the book we've been using. So we are looking at paper cutouts by Carl Walker, and she does drawings and illustrations and then projects them and then cuts them out as silhouettes. And she is playing around with the stereotypes of blackness on plantation life, often humiliating the slave masters in the drawings that she does. Collage, we begin to see in the 20th century. I think what's interesting about collage is the printing press is invented in 1455, but we really don't see collage as an art form until the early 20th century, where we are now cutting out magazines, newspapers, wallpaper, and then mixing them with other mediums. George Braque is doing this. This is being done by Dada artists who are trying to make kind of bad art and trying to shock you with not following proportions and rules. We see also from the Harlem Renaissance, Romare Bearden, who is taking different ephemera from magazines and then cutting them up and creating really jarring juxtapositions that have been described as showing a city falling apart and coming together at the same time. I think, though, for me, the master right now of collage in the world that I travel around in Los Angeles is Elliot Hunley. Elliot Hunley went to UCLA, and he has taken the collage, which usually you cut out paper and then you paste it on a surface. He is using large pieces of wood here, and yes, there are elements that he is pasting directly on the wood, but then he's also using these massive long pins, and he's stabbing pieces of paper and pushing the collage away from the surface. The magnifying glasses are a nice touch, creating compositions within the compositions, and they're just beautiful. They obviously take a lot of time to do. He's got great sensibilities for what he's doing. And I think what's really interesting in the work that we're about to see here is when you view it from the side. When you view one of these from the side, you get an idea of really what's going on there. And it must be so difficult to ship these. I think he is the greatest collage artist working today. After 100 years of collage, he did something totally different that I really never saw anyone do before him, at least to this level of making fine art. I think he is represented, where did I see his last show? Last time I saw his show was at Regan Projects also. He still might be at Regan Projects in LA in terms of his LA gallery. I don't know where else he is being represented around the world. All right, so for our drawing assignment, you have a quiz, and then I have an optional drawing assignment for you. So in this optional drawing assignment, I have a video, and I show you how Max Ernst makes frottage drawings by rubbing paper on leaves, on wood, and anything else that will make a kind of gritty, kind of three-dimensional surface. And you can do that, and you can basically make drawings and make art from that process. You can even add your own drawing to it. So once you've made the roughness of the face, you can put your own drawing. And we see Max Ernst do that. Take a look at the video if you want to do this. This is optional. If you don't do it, it's not graded against you. If you do it, it just goes into your grade file. The second part of this class is a discussion on appropriation art. Appropriation art is a postmodern form of art where artists take various either ephemera that already exists and cut it up and reuse it, like in a collage, or they are copying forms of art and not trying to hide that they're copying as they do it. They're appropriating it and using it. And I think sometimes it makes pretty interesting art, but I also want to talk about in our discussion maybe what should the limits or what are the rules in what can you appropriate, what shouldn't you appropriate. Here we're seeing a painting by Titian in the 1600s of Venus. We are looking at a young nude woman who is upper class, about to be dressed by her handmaidens, and maybe she's virginal, going to a wedding possibly. She's covering up her pubic bone, and she is looking at us in a way that says, hey, take a good look here. That idea is appropriated by Eduardo Manet in the 1800s, and he is showing us not an upper class woman, but instead a sex worker. And the sex worker is looking at us like, hey, what do you want? I've been working all day. We see the shoes and the flower and the choker, kind of signs of her profession, and her attendant is bringing her flowers, probably from some admirer of hers. And rather than the dog, we have the black cat kind of standing up in attention here. So Yasumasa Morimura is a Japanese photographer, and his whole career is made by appropriating Western images into Japanese art or Japanese culture, and kind of commenting on the way that America is influenced and takes from Japanese, like we have seen Jeff Wall take a photograph from Oksui in the ukiyo-e Japanese woodcut style. We saw that in our themes lecture. And here he has appropriated the sex worker. He has put the wig on. He's playing it in the same serious deadpan way that she is playing it. He is also playing his own attendant here, giving himself flowers. We have a cat over here, like a Hello Kitty cat in black. It has the palm up. That's why it reminds me of Hello Kitty. So everything here is a photograph that he has then put together, probably digitally, to make this really great appropriation of Manet. So appropriation in postmodernism. So postmodernism has traits like being playful, eccentric, multiple viewpoints, meanings, and references inspired by pop art, industrial materials, language, narratives from the oppressed, and institutional critique. We will see that as we go further in the class. So here is the original urinal by Marcel Duchamp. We saw this earlier in our class, where he invents a new kind of art, a ready-made, where the artist can simply designate it as a work of art. Sherry Levine has pointed to that original and then made a bronze of it, kind of further enshrining it as a golden moment in art. Richard Prince is maybe the earliest, or certainly one of the earliest appropriation artists. So he is someone who describes himself as having no skills whatsoever. He doesn't know how to paint, he doesn't know how to sculpt, and he uses a Polaroid camera. He's not a professional photographer. His appropriation art begins in 1975. He buys a magazine that has this ad for Marlboro cigarettes with their mascot, the Marlboro cowboy. They started using the cowboy post-World War II because they wanted men to smoke filtered cigarettes. Men thought that smoking filtered cigarettes was effeminate, so they put the handsome, rugged cowboy as their mascot, showing you there's nothing more masculine than a cowboy smoking a filtered Marlboro. And Richard Prince buys the magazine, takes a Polaroid, just of this area of it, blows it up, puts it in a frame, sells it as his own art. And it has resold at auction for more than $1 million by 2005, probably a lot more now. So he was sued for this because the photographer who took this said, hey, you stole my art and made money off it, didn't give me none. And it went to court, and a judge decided that the photographer did not have a claim to this because Richard changed. First of all, he bought the magazine legally, and then he photographed. He's not making a competing ad. He is instead showing us the effect of mass media on our psyche, embedding the idea of the cowboy and masculinity through cigarettes. And that's how kind of appropriation art is allowed to exist as a way for artists to make money. Again, he was sued in 2014 as he was taking images from his friends in Instagram, taking them, blowing them up, and then adding comments in. And in his comments, don't do anything, be yourself, he is adding copyright elements and registered trademarks, kind of telling you that he knows the game here in terms of what you can take and can't take. And again, people said, hey, you stole my photograph off of Instagram, and they lost that case also. Richard Prince continues to be the appropriation king. Now what I want to talk about briefly is, what about we have seen appropriation from media in magazines and from paintings, but where do we have to be sensitive in terms of appropriating? And I think one of the more obvious and difficult things that America has struggled with is the appropriation of Native Americans in sports teams and names for sports teams. Teams like the football team, the Washington Redskins, and that name which has changed now finally. So we often see mascots as these great powerful warriors, but always not a very flattering light, like the Atlanta Braves Chief Wahoo, a caricature of a Native American, not particularly dignified. And I think that that does mean something to a people that America tried to wipe out and has marginalized them to reservations, that perhaps they should have a little more say in how their image is being used. So what are the rules of appropriation? And for our discussion, I have 3 case studies. First one is Joe Scanlon, the guy at the bottom, and then Donnell Wolford, that is a fictitious personality created by Joe. Joe, I believe, is the head of the art department at Princeton in the Ivy League. He knows what he's doing. So he was making some artwork, I believe wood collages in his studio, and he had an idea that if someone besides him was making these, they would be better received if they had different historical and cultural references, in particular if they were made by a black woman. So he invents the character Donnell Wolford to perform and be the artist who is making, I'm assuming these are some of the collages back here, and he is hiring actresses to play Donnell Wolford. The great 2-year biennial at the Whitney Museum decided that this was a project that should be in the every 2-year biennial that would showcase the best of American art by whatever curator is curating the show. And there were some objectives. The Yams Collective withdrew from the biennial, stating basically, hey, black women are the most underrepresented demographic in American art, and you've taken one of those spots with a non-black woman. And there's a point there. But nevertheless, the show stayed up and it went on. Another Whitney controversy. So this controversy comes from a painting done by Dana Schutz. She is an artist who lives and works in Brooklyn, and she does a very Cubist style of painting. And she shows a Cubist style painting from a photograph of a murdered young black boy in Mississippi who was murdered in 1955 at the age of 14, having been falsely accused of flirting with a white woman. He was murdered and his face was disfigured with an outboard motor from a motorboat. His mother decided that they should have an open casket. She said, "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." And this photograph was reproduced in newspapers, and much of the outrage that comes from seeing this murdered teen helped galvanize white people around the struggle for black people to have basic human rights in the civil rights movement. So Dana has taken this painting with the idea that she says, "I'm a mother and I feel the pain of a mother losing her son." What Hannah Black, a black identified biracial artist, thought is that this is another example of white people profiting from black death and black struggles. TV shows like Cops that made millions, if not billions of dollars in advertising, chasing black and brown people around for television entertainment. So there was a protest at the Whitney where black people wore these shirts that said Black Death Spectacle, and they stood in front of the painting, not so far in front that you couldn't walk around them and see it, but enough that you had to walk around them. So what is the Whitney Museum supposed to do? Should they take the painting down? Should they kick out the protesters? And what the museum decided is that they would let them both stay. And they would allow the protest as long as they weren't destroying the paintings, and they would also allow the painting to stay so people could also get a thought about their own thoughts about the painting. I agree with Anuradha Vikram, a art historian who teaches at places like UCLA, who says that really what this is kind of lazy academic research by the artist. The artist should have taken more steps to realize what would have happened here. I think the possibility potentially of contacting Emmett Till's family to get permission to do this might be something to think about. And then the third of the case studies, this is from Chinatown in New York City. This is a work of videos by Omar Fast. He is, I believe, an immigrant from Pakistan, and he has taken at the Ethan Cohen Gallery, the James Cohen Gallery in Chinatown, and he puts video in there, but sometimes video is not always exciting, so he makes a installation, and the installation looks like what maybe the failing business that was here before the art gallery that began, say, the gentrification that's happening in Chinatown. And so we see broken chairs, we see a couple of cell phones under a glass case. You don't really recognize that it is an art gallery. Betty Yu, who is the co-founder of the Chinatown Art Brigade, she believes that this is racist, that depicting Chinatown as garbage and depicting Chinatown as failing is not very sensitive to the people in Chinatown. And so they had a protest where they talked about that. You can even see they put up the sign that was there before it was a gallery. So we have kind of lost sensibility of the time and place that this art installation is in. Are we in the previous iteration of the building? Is it a gallery? It's really confusing maybe as to what space we're in. However, maybe it is a bit insensitive to people who could be offended by it. What I would like you to do for your discussion is pick one of the three case studies. The poverty porn, where rich people go to poor neighborhoods to see how the poor are doing. The argument of Dana Schutz and the Black Death Spectacle of the Emmett Till painting at the Whitney, and Joe Scanlon and Donnell Wolford. Pick one of those three case studies, and then I would like you to write about it for our discussion. So you have the option of doing a frottage drawing, you have a quiz on the drawing lecture, And then also you have a discussion on the case studies of what should, and the other thing that I want you to answer in this assignment is, what do you think the rules should be for appropriation? Should you be allowed to take anything? Should there be limits to what you can take? If you do appropriate someone's culture, what are your responsibilities in terms of understanding that culture and trying to mitigate any sort of outrage that might come because of that art? That's what I'd like you to think about and write about and maybe make this week. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.